The kitchen never slept. Long after the palace above had gone quiet, after the last candle in the great hall guttered out and the guards changed their watch with the soft scrape of boots on stone, the kitchen breathed on. Fires banked low, bread dough resting beneath damp cloth, the slow drip of fat from a spit that had stopped turning hours ago, each drop landing in the pan below with a sound like a small, patient heartbeat. Mirren had learned to love this hour, the hour when the kitchen belonged to no one, and therefore, briefly, to her. She moved through the dark with the economy of someone who had memorized every surface, every hazard, every inch of space that was hers to occupy without permission. 3 steps from the sleeping alcove to the flour barrel, 7 steps to the hearth, 14 to the cold store, now where the stone sweated in winter and the smell of preserved meat and dried herbs pressed against the senses like a hand over the mouth. She did not need light. Light drew eyes, and eyes asked questions she could not answer. The bread needed turning. She did it without thinking, her hands finding the loaves by touch, pressing her knuckles into the dough the way her grandmother had taught her, not to test the rise, but to feel the life in it. Bread is alive, her grandmother had said, back when Mirren still had a grandmother and a home and a wolf that ran silver through her bones like a second bloodstream. Everything worth tending is alive. You have to learn its language before you can help it. She had been 14 when she stopped being able to hear that language. The phantom ache came the way it always did. Not as pain, exactly, but as absence. A hollow in the center of her chest where something warm and breathing used to live. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum for a moment. An old reflex, and felt nothing but her own heartbeat. Steady, singular, alone. Don't, she told herself, and meant it. She had learned not to mourn what she had chosen. The choice had been simple in the end, even if the cost was not. A life as a broken thing, or a life as Aldrich's mate. She had chosen the breaking, she would choose it again. The flour barrel needed refilling before the morning cooks arrived. Mirren hoisted the sack from the shelf, and the movement pulled at the old scar on her left shoulder. Not a wound from any blade, but from the ritual itself. The night she had knelt in the forest and spoken the words that severed her own bond. The scar tissue there was strange, almost luminous in certain lights, and she kept it hidden beneath her dress with the same vigilance she kept everything else hidden. The gray servant's dress helped. Everything about her life in this palace was designed to help her disappear. 3 years of disappearing. She had become very good at it. A sound from the corridor made her go still. Not footsteps, something slower. A shuffle, then a pause, then the soft impact of something small against the kitchen door. Mirren set down the flour sack without a sound and waited, her body arranged in the particular stillness that had kept her alive in this palace, not hiding exactly, but not present either. A ghost posture, a held breath made permanent. The door opened. A boy stood in the frame, one of the undercook's apprentices, she thought, wore until the firelight caught his face, and she saw that he was too young, too finely made, wearing a nightshirt that cost more than her entire year's wages. 6 years old, perhaps. His dark hair was tangled from sleep, and his eyes, when they found her in the dimness, were the color of hammered silver. She had seen those eyes before, in the portraits that lined the eastern corridor, in the face of the king himself, on the 3 occasions she had been close enough to see his face without being seen herself. One of the Pups, she realized, and the thought arrived with a cold clarity. One of the Alpha King's sons. He was shaking, not from cold, and the kitchen was warm enough, even banked low, but from something internal, something that moved through him in waves she could almost see. His small hands gripped the doorframe. Ear and his knuckles had gone white. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, and kept her voice very quiet, the way she kept everything about herself quiet. Not a command, just a fact, offered gently. "I know," he said. His voice was steadier than she expected. "Rin won't stop." "Rin?" "My brother." He swallowed. "He can't. He keeps trying to shift and he can't finish it. It hurts him. I can hear it even when I put the pillow over my ears." Mirren looked at the boy for a moment. She looked at the door behind him, at the dark corridor beyond, at the absolute certainty of what would happen to her if she was found in conversation with the Alpha King's son in the middle of the night. The exile order already waited on the king's desk with her name on it. She did not need to give anyone additional reasons. Walk away, she thought. You are a ghost. Ghosts do not intervene. But she had also stood between a drunk elder and a young servant girl last winter, and taken the blow across her back without making a sound, and she had not been able to explain that either. "Take me to him, you," she said. The boy, she would learn later that his name was Soren, stared at her for a moment as if he had not expected compliance. Then he turned and led her into the dark. The servants' passages ran parallel to the main corridors, narrow and unlit, and Mirren followed the boy through them with her hand trailing the wall. She could hear it before she could see anything, a sound that pressed against the ears and then against something deeper, something beneath the ears, in the bone. A child's cry, but fractured, doubled back on itself. What the human voice breaking into something that was not quite a howl and not quite a scream, but occupied the terrible space between. The sound of a wolf that could not find its own shape. She had heard it once before, years ago, when a young pack member had suffered a trauma so severe that his wolf had fragmented. She had helped then too, before she had any reason to hide what she knew, before hiding became survival. Soren pushed open a door, and the sound hit her like a wall. The room was large, clearly a nursery of some kind, though everything in it was scaled to the grandeur of the palace, carved furniture, heavy drapes, a fire that had been built up high and was now burning itself ragged. On the floor between the beds, a second boy lay curled on his side, his body rigid, his breath coming in short, desperate bursts. My two palace healers stood at the edges of the room, their faces tight with the particular helplessness of people who had run out of tools. A third figure, a woman in moon priestess robes, pressed her hands together at the window and murmured something that was clearly not working. No one looked at Mirren when she entered. She was a servant. She was furniture. She crossed the room and knelt beside the boy on the floor. He was burning, not with fever, with something older, something that lived in the wolf blood and had no name in the healer's texts she had studied. His wolf was trying to surface and finding no clear path, no anchor, no voice that spoke its language. She recognized the sensation, the way she recognized her own phantom ache, from the inside. She did not think about what she was doing. She simply did it. She placed one hand on the boy's back, between his shoulder blades, and she began to hum. The melody came from somewhere she did not visit often, the part of her that still remembered what it felt like to have a wolf, to be whole, to know the old frequencies that ran beneath the pack's awareness like an underground river. The sound that came from her throat was not music exactly. It was more like a question asked in a language older than words. I know you. I know this pain. You are not lost. You are here. The boy's rigid body softened by degrees. The healers went very still. Soren, standing in the doorway, let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for hours. Mirren kept humming, her hand steady on the boy's back, and did not look up. She did not see the door at the far end of the room open. And she did not see the enormous figure that filled the frame, going absolutely motionless the moment her sound reached him. She did not see the Alpha King's silver eyes fix on her with an expression that was not recognition, not quite, but was the thing that lived just before recognition, the moment before a fire catches, when the spark has already landed and the world has not yet understood what is about to burn. 3 months was a long time to be dead. Not literally, not yet. But Mirren had learned, in the weeks since the council's vote, that there was a particular quality to borrowed time. It tasted like the last swallow of water before a long crossing. It felt like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, knowing the ice would hold for now, knowing it would not hold forever. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, wore the bristle brush moving in the same circular pattern it had moved every morning for 3 years. The stone was cold beneath her palms. The water in the bucket had gone gray with grime. Around her, the kitchen breathed its familiar rhythms, the clatter of iron pots, the hiss of steam from the bread ovens, the low argument between the head cook and the boy who had oversalted the broth again. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her. She was furniture. She was the floor itself. Good, she thought. That is exactly what I need to be. The exile order sat on the Alpha King's desk unsigned. She knew this because Petra, the laundress who had worked the palace for 30 years and knew every current in its political waters, had told her so 2 weeks ago in a whisper that cost Petra nothing and Mirren everything. He hasn't signed it yet, Petra had said, not unkindly, pressing a heel of bread into Mirren's hands as if food could cushion the information. But he will. He always does, eventually. He just signs what Thorne puts in front of him. Mirren had thanked her. She had eaten the bread. She had gone back to scrubbing. The order was not the worst part. The worst part was that her father had signed his name to the petition requesting her exile. She had seen the document herself, 3 months ago, when Councillor Thorne had made a point of reading it aloud in the servants' hall, not because he needed to, but because he wanted her to hear it. Her father's signature, her family's seal. The formal declaration that Mirren of House Vielle was no longer recognized as kin, no longer protected by bloodline, no longer anything at all. She had not cried, and she had been too tired to cry. The brush moved in its circles. The water went gray. 3 months, she thought, and still breathing, she had developed a system for survival that she ran through each morning like a prayer. Eyes down, voice soft, hands busy. Never be the first to speak. Never be the last to leave a room. Never let anyone look at her long enough to notice the silver in her eyes, or the way she sometimes tilted her head when a pack member was in pain, hearing something in the frequency of their distress that she had no right to hear anymore. The wolf severing had taken her ability to shift. It had not taken everything. Some residue of the old bond remained, a phantom limb, a ghost frequency, and it made her dangerous in ways she could not fully explain. It also made her useful in ways she could not afford to demonstrate. She had broken her own rule twice in 3 months. Once for the young stable boy, Finn, who had been thrown from a horse and lay in the courtyard with a dislocated shoulder, screaming in a register that made every wolf in the palace flinch away. She had knelt beside him, pressed her hands to the joint, and hummed 3 bars of the old healer's song before she caught herself. The shoulder had slid back into place. Finn had stopped screaming. She had walked away before anyone could ask how she'd known what to do. The second time had been worse. A senior maid named Corva had collapsed in the linen corridor, her body locked in the particular rigidity that came when a wolf's bond to their pack alpha frayed under stress. It was not a medical emergency, not technically. But Mirren had recognized the signs. She had pressed her palm flat against Corva's sternum and pushed something through the contact, some remnant of the old healer's frequency, and Corva's body had unknotted itself, and she had drawn a full breath and looked up at Myron with an expression that was half gratitude and half suspicion. "How did you do that?" Corva had asked. "I didn't do anything," Myron had said. "You just needed to breathe." Corva had not reported her, but she had watched Myron differently since then, with a careful, measuring attention that made the back of Myron's neck prickle every time their paths crossed. The brush moved. The water went gray. The kitchen breathed. Somewhere above her, in the upper reaches of the palace where the air was warmer and the floors were marble instead of stone, the Alpha King was holding his morning council. She knew his schedule the way she knew the kitchen's rhythms. Not because she sought the information, but because information was the only currency available to someone with nothing else. He rose before dawn. He trained with his generals in the east courtyard until the sun cleared the tree line. He took his council meetings in the obsidian chamber from the 3rd bell until midday. He ate alone. He had been eating alone for 6 years. She did not think about him often. He was a fact of her existence the way the cold was a fact, pervasive, impersonal, requiring no emotional response. He had signed dozens of exile orders without ever reading the names attached to them. She was one name among many. She had made her peace with this. "You have not made your peace with this," said the honest part of her mind. The part she usually managed to keep quiet. "You are furious. You are terrified. You are 22 years old, and you have been sentenced to die by a man who does not know you exist." She pressed the brush harder against the stone. The kitchen door opened, and the cold that came through it was different from the usual draft, sharper, carrying the particular charge that preceded a shift in the palace's atmosphere. Mirren did not look up. She tracked the newcomer by sound. Heavy boots, a deliberate stride, the subtle displacement of air that came with significant physical mass. A pair of boots stopped beside her bucket. "You," said a voice she did not recognize. "Kitchen maid. The one who fixed the stable boy's shoulder?" Oh no, she looked up slowly, and the man standing over her wore the gray and silver of the Alpha King's personal guard. Not the general palace security, but the inner circle. He was watching her with the flat, assessing expression of someone who had been sent to collect information. "I didn't fix anything," she said. "He just needed—" "The Alpha King's sons are in distress." The guard's voice carried no inflection. "The healers have been with them since last night. The moon priestess was sent for at dawn. Nothing has worked." Mirren's hands went still on the brush. "I'm a kitchen maid," she said carefully. "You are," the guard agreed. "And yet—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The "and yet" contained everything. Finn's shoulder, Corva's locked body, whatever else had been noticed and catalogued and reported by eyes she had not known were watching. More the honest part of her mind spoke again, very quietly. This is the moment. This is where borrowed time ends. She could refuse. She could keep her eyes down, and her voice soft and her hands busy, and let the pups scream until the healers found another solution. She could protect herself. She could survive another day, another week, another borrowed month. She thought of the sound of a child in pain, that specific frequency, the one that bypassed every rational defense and went straight to the oldest part of her, the part that still remembered what it was to be a healer before she had made herself into a ghost. She set down the brush. The water in the bucket was perfectly still for a moment, reflecting the kitchen's firelight in a small wavering circle. Then her hand broke the surface as she rinsed her palms. More than the reflection shattered into pieces that briefly held the shape of something she could not name. "Take me to them," she said. The guard's expression did not change. He turned and walked toward the door without waiting to see if she followed. She followed. She did not look back at the bucket, the brush, the gray water. She did not look back at the kitchen that had been her world for 3 years, the invisible life she had built from nothing, the careful ghost existence she was almost certainly walking away from forever. She had made her choice at 14, in a ritual circle with a knife pressed to the place where her wolf lived. She had learned since then that choices did not stop arriving just because you had already paid for one. The screaming started at midnight. Mirren heard it from 3 floors below, where through stone walls thick enough to muffle cannon fire, through the servants' corridor where she'd been carrying a basket of linens toward the laundry. The sound stopped her cold, not because it was loud, though it was, but because of its quality. 2 voices braided together in a frequency that bypassed her ears entirely and landed somewhere behind her sternum. A sound like something tearing that had never been meant to tear. She stood in the corridor and listened, and her hands, without her permission, set the basket down. Pups, she thought. Those are pups in a shift lock. She'd heard it once before, years ago, when she still lived in her father's house and still had a wolf to feel it with. A neighbor's child, caught between forms during a fever. The sound had lasted 6 hours. The child had survived, barely. Ian walked with a limp ever after. Mirren had been the one to sit with him through the worst of it, humming the old songs her grandmother had taught her, pressing her palms flat against his trembling back until the fever broke. She picked the basket back up. Set it down again. Not your place, she told herself. Not your pups. Not your problem. The screaming climbed another register, and something in her chest answered it. Not her wolf, which was gone, which had been gone for 9 years, but something older than her wolf. Something that lived in the marrow of her bones and remembered what it meant to be a healer before it remembered what it meant to be afraid. She left the basket in the corridor and walked toward the sound. The royal den occupied the entire east wing of the 3rd floor, and behind doors of black iron that stood twice her height. 2 guards flanked the entrance, and they turned toward her with expressions that moved through surprise, contempt, and dismissal in the span of a single breath. Servants' access is— I know, Myron said. I need to go in. The guard on the left, broad-shouldered, young, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been listening to screaming for too long, looked at her with something that wasn't quite a laugh. You need to go in. The royal healers are in there. The moon priestess is in there. The elder council sent 3 representatives, and you need to go in. Yes, she said. The screaming spiked again, and all 3 of them flinched. The guard's hand moved to the door before his mind caught up with the motion. He stopped himself, jaw tight. Shh, let her through, said a voice from inside. Not a request, not a suggestion. The kind of voice that didn't need to be either. The doors opened. The obsidian chamber was chaos wearing a still face. Mirren took it in pieces the way her grandmother had taught her to assess a crisis. The 2 small boys on the marble floor, their bodies shuddering through incomplete shifts, fur appearing and dissolving along their arms, their spines arching in angles that should have been impossible, their faces cycling between human and wolf in a rhythm that had no rhythm at all. The healers clustered at the room's perimeter, their expressions arranged into professional calm that didn't reach their eyes. The moon priestess, an ancient woman with chalk-white hair, sat cross-legged near the fireplace with her hands pressed flat to the floor, chanting something low and continuous that the boys screaming swallowed whole, and at the center of it all, standing perfectly still in a way that cost him something enormous, the Alpha King. She had never been this close to him. She had seen him from across the great hall, from behind pillars, from the shadows of doorways, always at a distance that made him manageable, abstract, a figure of authority rather than a person. Up close, he was neither abstract nor manageable. He was very, very real, and the reality of him hit her before she could prepare for it. Don't look at his face, she told herself. Don't look at his eyes. Look at the pups. Only the pups. She looked at the pups. They were 6 years old, she knew. Everyone in the palace knew the Alpha King's sons, even if only by reputation. Identical, dark-haired, aught with their father's jaw and something softer around the eyes that must have come from their mother. Right now, they were suffering in a way that made her throat close, and the suffering was specific. Not a fever shift, not a trauma response, but a resonance, fracture. Their wolves were trying to sync with each other the way twin wolves sometimes did, and the synchronization had gone wrong, each wolf amplifying the other's distress in an escalating loop that would not stop until something external broke the cycle. She crossed the room. "Stop," said the Alpha King. She stopped, looked up despite herself. His eyes were silver gray, the color of a winter sky at the precise moment before snow. They were also, she realized with a lurch that she felt in her back teeth, the same color as her own. And she had never been close enough to notice that before. She noticed it now and filed it away in the part of her mind that cataloged dangerous information and made herself look back at the boys. "I can help them," she said. "You are a kitchen maid." Yes. She didn't deny it. Denying it would take longer than she had. "And I know what's wrong with them. It's a resonance fracture. Their wolves are caught in a feedback loop. The chanting is making it worse. The more external sound you introduce, the more their wolves have to fight through to find each other." Silence, except for the boys screaming, which had dropped half a register in the last 30 seconds. She didn't know why. She hadn't done anything yet. The healers have been treating it like a fever shift," she said, and then caught herself. Because that was not the voice of a kitchen maid. That was the voice of someone trained in the old methods, and she heard her own accent slip toward the formal dialect of the noble houses before she dragged it back. "I've seen this before. Please, let me try." Something moved across his face, not softening exactly, but a crack in the stone. His son screamed, and the crack widened. "If you harm them," he said, "I will end you before you reach the door." "I know," she said, and meant it, and moved. She knelt between the boys on the cold marble, close enough that her knees nearly touched each of them, and she did the only thing she knew to do. She placed one hand flat against each boy's chest, directly over the heart, and she began to hum. Not a song exactly, more like a frequency, something her grandmother had called the bone note, and the sound that lived at the bottom of the throat and resonated with the wolf's most primitive layer, the part that predated language and hierarchy and pack law, the part that only knew safe, still. Here. The older twin, she thought he was older, his face had a slightly sharper cast, went still first. Not calm, not sleeping, but still. His body stopped its frantic cycling and held one form, human, trembling but coherent. His brother followed 12 seconds later. The silence that fell was so complete that Mirren could hear her own heartbeat. And behind it, like an echo of something she'd lost, the ghost pulse of the wolf she no longer had. She kept humming, kept her hands where they were. The boys' breathing slowed, synchronized, found a rhythm that matched each other rather than fighting it. There, she thought. There you are. Did you were always going to find each other? She felt the moment the Alpha King moved closer, not because she heard him, but because the air changed. His scent reached her before his shadow did. Something that had no name in any language she knew. Something that made the ghost pulse in her chest stutter and reach, the way a severed limb was said to reach for the hand it no longer had. She did not look up. She did not stop humming, but her hands, pressed flat against the sleeping pups' chests, had begun to tremble. The pups went still. Not gradually, not in the way that exhausted children finally surrendered to sleep, but all at once, as if some invisible hand had reached into the room and smoothed the air flat. Brennan's small fingers uncurled from the marble floor. Kyle's back arched once, twice, then settled. The flickering between forms, that terrible, nauseating shimmer of fur appearing and dissolving along their arms, their shoulders, the crowns of their heads, simply stopped. Mirren kept humming. She didn't know she was doing it, not at first. The sound had come from somewhere below conscious thought, rising through her chest, the way water rises through stone, slow, inevitable, finding the path of least resistance. It was the melody her grandmother had taught her, the one with no name in any language she knew, the one that existed only in the hands and the throat and the place behind the sternum where grief and love lived together without distinction. Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. She knelt on the cold marble, both knees aching, and kept her eyes on the boys. Not on the king, not on the council members frozen along the walls like paintings of themselves. Not on the moon priestess, whose mouth had fallen open in an expression Mirren couldn't afford to interpret. Just the boys. Brennan, who had his father's jaw already at 6 years old, the stubborn set of it even in unconscious distress. Cale, who was smaller and whose wolf flickers had been more violent, whose small hands had left actual claw marks in the stone. She reached out and placed one palm flat against Cale's back. The heat of him was extraordinary, fever bright, the temperature of a body fighting itself. She felt the tremor still moving through him, deep as a fault line, and she pressed her hand more firmly and let the hum shift lower, into a register that vibrated in her own ribs. Her severed wolf bond pulsed once, in a phantom ache so sharp she nearly lost the melody. But she held it. She held it because the alternative was watching these children suffer, and she had never been able to watch suffering without moving toward it. Cale's trembling slowed. Mirren moved her other hand to Brennan's shoulder, completing the circuit, and the melody changed without her deciding to change it, branching, harmonizing with itself, becoming something richer than a single voice should have been able to produce. The sound filled the chamber. She felt it in the floor beneath her knees, in the cold air against her face, in the phantom space where her wolf used to live. Both boys breathed out together, long, slow, the breath of children finally sleeping. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Myron had ever heard. She became aware of the room in stages. At the fire in the wall sconces, burning lower than it should have been, the smell of spent magic, the moon priestess's chanting had left a residue in the air like scorched copper. The sound of someone's controlled exhale from the far side of the chamber, a sound that carried the specific quality of a man who had trained himself not to show relief. She did not look up. Don't look up. You are no one. You are a kitchen maid who wandered in at the wrong moment. You are already forgetting this happened. Who are you? It wasn't a question. The Alpha King's voice landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Not loud, but displacing everything around it, sending ripples to the edges of the space. Myron felt it in her back teeth. She felt it in the base of her spine. She felt it in the severed place where her wolf had once lived, but which had no business feeling anything at all. She kept her hands on the boys. Moving them now felt dangerous, like lifting a bandage before a wound had closed. A kitchen maid, Your Majesty. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. I heard the disturbance from the lower corridor. I shouldn't have entered. I apologize. You shouldn't have entered, he repeated. No. And yet you did. Yes. A pause. She counted her own heartbeats. 4, 5, 6. Look at me. No, absolutely not. Looking up is the end of everything. Her chin lifted anyway. She had prepared herself. In the abstract way one prepares for something one has never experienced. She had seen him at a distance, crossing the courtyard, a dark shape attended by other dark shapes. She had formed an impression of scale and authority, and the particular way powerful men moved through space, as if the space itself made accommodations for them. She had not prepared for his eyes. They were the same color as hers, not similar. The same. Silver gray, the shade of ice over deep water, the shade that marked old bloodlines and older magic. The shade she had spent 3 years keeping hidden beneath lowered lashes because it was too distinctive, too recognizable, too much a sign of what she actually was. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not anger, not the cold dismissal she'd expected. Something that moved across his face like weather. There and gone and there again, too fast to catch and hold. He doesn't know. He can't know. He's never seen your file. He signed the order without reading it. Now she dropped her gaze back to the boys. They need to sleep undisturbed for several hours, she said, and her voice only wavered slightly on the last word. The shift limbo exhausts them. If someone could carry them to their beds without waking them. I know what my sons need. The sharpness of it cut the air. She absorbed it without flinching, which was something she had become very good at. Of course, Your Majesty. Movement from the left. Counselor Thorne. She recognized his footsteps from 3 years of learning, which footsteps to avoid. He moved to the king's side and spoke in a low voice that he clearly believed she couldn't hear. She could hear everything. She had always been able to hear everything. The girl is one of the kitchen staff. She has no business in this wing. A pause, weighted with something deliberate. Or she is also, if I'm not mistaken, the Omega whose exile order is currently awaiting your signature. The room changed temperature. Mirren did not move. She kept her hands on the boys. She kept her breathing even. She thought about the crack in the marble floor 6 inches from her left knee. A thin, dark line that branched at the end like a river delta, like a choice made too late to unmake. There it is. There's the end of the borrowed time. Is that so? The king said. Not to her, to Thorn. But the words fell across her back like something physical. The order has been on your desk for 3 months, my lord. The council has been patient, but the matter requires resolution. A wolfless Omega, with no pack affiliation, no mate bond, no— I can hear you, Mirren said. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. She hadn't planned to say it. The words had simply arrived, the way the humming had arrived, from somewhere below the level of strategy or self-preservation. She was aware, distantly, that she had just made a catastrophic error. She was also aware that she couldn't take it back, and that some part of her, the part that had stood between a drunk elder and a frightened girl, the part that had chosen a forbidden ritual over a brutal marriage, had no interest in taking it back. She looked up again, not at Thorn, at the king. I can hear you, she said again, quieter. I thought you should know. Cale's expression did something complicated. The muscle along his jaw tightened. His silver-gray eyes moved over her face with a focus that felt like pressure, like hands pressing gently against both temples. Then one of the boys, Brennan, made a small sound in his sleep. A contented sound, the sound of a child dreaming something good. And something shifted in the king's face so fast she almost missed it. A crack in the stone, a door opening a 1/4 inch before someone's hand pressed it closed again. Thorn, he said, without looking away from her. Leave us. My lord, I don't think— Leave us. The counselor left. The generals followed. The moon priestess gathered her things with the careful movements of someone memorizing everything she saw. The chamber emptied until it held only the king, his sleeping sons, and a kitchen maid kneeling on cold marble with her hands still resting on 2 small, finely peaceful backs. The fire crackled. Somewhere distant, wind moved against the palace walls. What is your name? Kyle said. And Mirren, Sus, who had answered to Maid or nothing for 3 years, who had buried her grandmother's gift beneath gray linen and downcast eyes, who had spent every day since her severing learning to take up less and less space in the world. Mirren opened her mouth and told him. The pups slept. Kyle stood at the threshold of the inner chamber and watched them breathe. Rin on his left side, one small fist pressed against his cheek. Cale curled into himself like a question mark, his dark lashes still damp. They had not slept like this in 3 weeks. Not since the lunar cycle began its pull toward the eclipse and their wolves started fighting them from the inside out, tearing at the seams of their small bodies with a ferocity that had broken 4 healers and sent the moon priestess home in tears. They slept now because of her. He did not look at her directly. He had not looked at her directly since she knelt beside his sons and opened her mouth and unmade him. She is a servant, he told himself. She is nothing. She is already sentenced. His wolf disagreed. His wolf had been disagreeing for the past 40 minutes with an intensity that made his jaw ache from the effort of holding himself still. Counselor Thorn materialized at his shoulder. The man had a gift for appearing precisely when Cale least wanted company. My king. His voice was pitched low, careful. The girl should be removed before the pups wake. Her presence in the royal chambers is irregular. Her presence calmed them. Cale kept his voice flat. Every other presence failed. A fortunate accident. Thorn's certainty was a smooth, unbroken thing. Kitchen maids sometimes have an affinity for distressed animals. It means nothing beyond instinct. Distressed animals. The phrase landed wrong somewhere behind Kyle's sternum. He said nothing. Across the chamber, the girl, Mirren, someone had said her name was Myron, and the word had done something strange to his pulse, sat with her back against the far wall, her knees drawn up, her eyes on the floor. She had not moved since the pups stilled. She had not asked for anything, had not looked at him once. Her dark hair had come loose from its binding on one side, a single strand curving against her jaw, and Cale's wolf fixed on that detail with an attention that was almost violent. He needed to stop. Send her back to the kitchens, he said. Thorn exhaled, relief, barely concealed. Of course. You're in the exile order. I didn't ask about the exile order. A pause. No, of course not, my king. Kyle crossed the chamber. He told himself he was checking on the pups. He was checking on the pups. He stopped 3 feet from where Mirren sat against the wall and looked down at her, and she still did not look up. And something about that, the deliberate, practiced quality of her stillness, caught at him like a splinter. "Stand up," he said. She stood, smooth, unhurried, with that economy of motion he'd noticed when she first entered, the movement of someone trained to take up as little space as possible. Her eyes remained at the level of his collarbone. "Look at me." A beat. 2. Then she lifted her gaze. Silver. Her eyes were silver gray, the precise shade of a winter sky an hour before snowfall. And the mate bond that had been smoldering in his chest since she first hummed that impossible melody detonated like a struck flint catching tinder that had been laid for years. His wolf surged, not toward her, at her, through him, a recognition so primal it bypassed every rational faculty he possessed and went straight for the oldest part of him, the part that remembered what it was to be whole. No. He held himself motionless through sheer force of will. The bond pulled at the space between his ribs. He refused it. "What is your name?" His voice came out level. He was proud of that. "Mirren." She said it quietly, without inflection, as if the word were a stone she was setting down rather than offering. "How did you know what to do for them?" Her gaze dropped again. Not quickly, but with the careful deliberateness of someone recalibrating. "I didn't know. I heard them from the corridor. I came because—" She stopped, started again. "I used to know the old songs, before." Before. The word carried weight she didn't explain, and Cale's wolf pressed against the inside of his chest, wanting to know the shape of that weight, wanting to press its nose against every hidden thing she carried. "Where did you learn them?" "My grandmother." A pause so brief it might have been imagined. She was a healer. Kyle studied her face, the pale skin, the careful blankness of her expression, the slight tension at the corner of her mouth that suggested she was measuring every word before releasing it. She was not a kitchen maid. Or rather, she was, but she had not always been. And the distance between those two truths was something she guarded with her whole body. His wolf knew her. That was the unbearable part. Not recognized her. Knew her the way a wolf knows its own territory. The way a body knows the particular weight of a hand it has been waiting for. He had felt this once before. 18 years ago, in a meadow at the edge of the northern forest, when Alara had turned to look at him and the world had rearranged itself around the fact of her. The memory hit him like cold water. He stepped back. "You'll stay," he said. The words came out before he'd decided to say them. His wolf's doing, not his mind's. "Until the eclipse passes, the pups will need—" He stopped, restarted. "They respond to you. That is useful." Something moved across her face. Not surprise. Something more complicated than surprise. One a calculation, almost. Then it was gone. "As you wish, my king." He turned away from her before his wolf could do anything else without his permission. Thorn was waiting near the door, his expression arranged into careful neutrality that did not quite conceal the sharpness underneath. He had watched the entire exchange. Cale could see him cataloging it, filing it, drawing conclusions Cale was not prepared to examine. "A word," Thorn said when they were in the corridor and the chamber door had closed behind them. "Make it brief." "The exile order." Thorn's voice was measured, deliberate. "It has been pending your signature for 3 months. The council grows restless. There are questions about why a wolfless Omega who performed a forbidden severing ritual has been permitted to remain in the palace this long." He paused. Questions that will become louder now that she has been seen in the royal chambers. Kale stopped walking. He turned the information over in his mind. Wolfless Omega. Forbidden severing ritual. He had signed that order, or rather, he had been handed a stack of administrative documents and signed them all without reading them, as he did every 3rd week when the council brought him the accumulated decisions of the realm. He had not read her name. He had not read her file. She severed her own bond. The question came out before he could stop it. Thorn's eyes sharpened. "Voluntarily, at 14, the circumstances are—" He chose his next word with precision. "Irregular. The council's position is that a wolf who would sever her own bond is capable of any transgression. She is a corruption risk." Corruption risk. Kyle thought of the pups. He finally sleeping. He thought of the sound that had come from the chamber, that melody, that impossible melody that had reached through the walls and made his wolf go quiet for the first time in weeks. He thought of silver eyes that did not flinch. "The order stands," he said, because it had to, because the alternative was examining why he'd said, "You'll stay," to a sentenced woman, and he was not ready for that examination. but it will not be executed during the eclipse. The pups need stability. Thorne absorbed this. And after the eclipse? After the eclipse, Kale said, we will discuss it. He walked away before Thorne could press further, back toward his own chambers, away from the soft sound of his son's breathing and the woman sitting against the wall who smelled like moonflower and something ancient and devastating. For his wolf turned in circles behind his ribs. Restless, certain. Wrong, Kyle told it. You are wrong about her. But he had said you'll stay, and he had meant it, and somewhere beneath the cold architecture of his certainty, something had already begun to crack. The morning after the pups slept came in hard and gray, the kind of dawn that looked like an apology. Mirren had not slept. She had returned to the kitchen before the last candle guttered, taken her place at the long stone table, and begun the work of peeling roots for the morning broth. Her hands moved through the familiar motions while her mind refused to settle. The pups' faces kept surfacing, the way the smaller one, Roan, had curled his fingers into her sleeve even in sleep, as if she were an anchor and he knew it. The way the other, Kale, had exhaled a sound so close to relief that it had pressed against something behind her sternum and stayed there. She had not let herself think about the king. The kitchen filled slowly around her, the bread maker arriving with flour-dusted hands, the scullery girls dragging in water from the well, the head cook moving through the space like a general surveying a battlefield. No one spoke to Myron. No one looked at her. She was the ghost she had always been, and she was grateful for it. Stay invisible. Stay small. 2 more weeks, maybe 3, and the exile order will come regardless. Don't give them a reason to hurry it. She had almost convinced herself the night had meant nothing when Counselor Thorne walked through the kitchen door. He never came to the kitchen. In 3 years of service, and Myron had never once seen him below the 2nd floor. He was a man built for marble corridors and high-backed chairs, for the particular light that fell through council chamber windows and made ordinary men look like they were carved from something ancient. He wore his gray robes like armor, and his eyes, pale, the color of ice over deep water, moved through the room with the systematic precision of someone cataloging threats. They stopped on her. Mirren kept peeling. Her hands did not shake. She had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of armor. You. Thorne's voice carried across the kitchen, and the bread maker went quiet, and the scullery girls found reasons to look at the floor. Come with me. She set down the root. She wiped her hands on her apron. And she followed him out of the kitchen and into the narrow servants' corridor that ran alongside the great hall, and she kept her eyes on the stone floor and her breathing even. And she thought about the pattern of the flagstones, how some were darker than others, how the mortar between them had cracked in places and been refilled with something slightly different in color. Thorne stopped at the corridor's end, where a window let in the gray morning light, and turned to face her. Look at me, he said. She looked up. His expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. A rapid calculation, the kind that happened when a man confirmed a suspicion he had been carrying for some time. There it is, he said softly. I thought so. He sees it. He sees the eyes, the silver gray that she had inherited from her grandmother, and the healer of old bloodline, the color that marked families who had carried the old gifts for generations. She had kept her gaze down for 3 years. 3 years of staring at floors and table surfaces and the middle distance, and one night of looking directly at an alpha king had undone all of it. I don't know what you mean, counselor. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. Your eyes, Thorne said, are the same color as the king's. He let that sit between them for a moment, the way a man sets down a blade to let you see its length. That is not a coincidence that I am prepared to ignore. Many people have gray eyes. Not that gray. He stepped closer, and she held her ground because stepping back would tell him something. I have served this king for 12 years. I know what the old bloodline markers look like. Are your family the Vial line, yes? Minor nobility, disgraced. Your grandmother was Sarah Vial, the healer. He watched her face. She was also the last known carrier of the Lunaris gift, the ability to soothe fractured wolf bonds through sound and touch. A pause, deliberate and precise. Which is exactly what you did last night in the royal den. The flagstone beneath her left foot had a crack running diagonally across it, old and deep, filled with darker mortar. She focused on it. I hummed a children's song, she said. The pups were distressed. I reacted. I didn't think. No, Thorne agreed, and his agreeableness was worse than accusation. You didn't think. That was your mistake. He clasped his hands behind his back. The king noticed you, girl. I watched his face. And whatever happened in that room when you walked in, His wolf recognized something, I don't know what, and I don't intend to find out, because the answer would be inconvenient for everyone. He let the word inconvenient do its work. Your exile order is on his desk. It has been there for 3 months. I am going to ensure it is signed by the end of this week. The crack in the flagstone, the darker mortar, the way the morning light came through the window at an angle that made the stone look almost warm. I understand, she said. I wonder if you do. Thorne's voice dropped, and for just a moment something moved through it that was not quite cruelty. Something older, more tired. You are not the first broken thing to wander into this palace looking for shelter. You will not be the last. But you made yourself visible last night. Invisible things get examined, and examined things get found out. He turned toward the corridor. Stay out of the upper floors. Stay away from the royal den. If the king asks for you specifically, you will send word to me before you respond. He left without waiting for her answer. Mirren stood at the window for a long moment after his footsteps faded. The gray morning pressed against the glass. Somewhere above her, in the royal den, 2 small boys were probably waking up and she would not be there, and she had no right to grieve that. A week, less maybe. Thorne moves fast when he's decided. She was still standing there when the sound reached her. Boots on stone, a different cadence than the servant's shuffle, heavier and deliberate. She turned before she meant to, and Cale was at the corridor's far end. Alone. Which was unusual enough that it registered as wrong before anything else did. He stopped when he saw her. The distance between them was perhaps 20 feet of narrow corridor, and the gray light fell across his face and made the silver in his hair look like something poured rather than grown, and his eyes, those eyes, the same impossible color as hers, fixed on her with an attention that had nothing of the king in it and everything of the wolf. She should have looked away. She knew she should have looked away. She didn't. The silence stretched between them, and in it she heard the distant sound of wind against the palace walls, and her own pulse, and nothing else. The pups are asking for you, Kyle said. His voice in the narrow corridor was different than it had been in the great chamber. Lower, less performed, like a door opened onto a room he didn't usually show anyone. Counselor Thorne has asked me to stay away from the upper floors, she said. The truth, plainly stated, because she had no more room for strategy. Something moved across Kyle's face. Not anger. Something more controlled than anger, and more dangerous for it. His jaw tightened. The muscle at the corner of it flickered once and went still. Thorne, he said, does not give orders to my household staff. He is your counselor. He is my advisor. The distinction in his voice was a wall with a locked door in it. There is a difference. Mirren looked at him. Really looked, the way she had not permitted herself last night. The way she had been paying for all morning. The ritual scars at his collar. Yet the particular stillness of a man who had learned to hold enormous things very quietly. The way he was watching her, with an expression she couldn't name because it was made of too many things at once. He doesn't know what he's looking at. But his wolf does. And Thorne knows his wolf does. And that is why I am already dead. Your sons were very brave last night, she said, because it was true and because it was safe and because she needed to say something that wasn't the thing she was actually thinking. Kyle was quiet for a moment. They were frightened, he said. There is a difference between brave and frightened. Sometimes, Mirren said carefully, they're the same thing. He looked at her for one more breath, long enough that she felt it in the back of her throat, that silver gaze like pressure, like recognition, like a word in a language she had almost forgotten she knew. Then he said, come upstairs, and turned and walked away, and she followed him, because her feet moved before her mind gave permission, and because somewhere in the severed place where her wolf used to live, something that should have been silent was not. The summons came at dawn, not for Myron, she was never summoned anywhere. The summons came for the head housekeeper, Madame Boss, delivered by a council page in formal gray who stood in the kitchen doorway with his chin lifted and his eyes fixed carefully above the heads of the servants. Mirren watched from the bread table, her hands still dusted with flour, as Voss read the folded parchment twice, then a third time, her expression doing something complicated and controlled. Carry on, Voss said to no one in particular. He even followed the page out. Mirren turned back to her dough. She pressed the heel of her hand into it and counted her breaths. It's about the pups, she told herself. It's about the incident with the healers, or the moon priestess's failed chanting, or any of a dozen things that have nothing to do with you. The dough tore under her hands. She hadn't been pressing hard enough to tear it. Voss returned within the hour, and she came straight to Myron. That had never happened before. In 3 years of kitchen work, Madame Voss had spoken to Myron perhaps 11 times, and never with the particular quality of attention she wore now. Something careful and assessing, the way a woman looks at a door she isn't sure she wants to open. "The council wishes to speak with you," Voss said, low enough that the other maids couldn't hear. The full council. "I'm in the eastern chamber." The flower on Mirren's hands had gone cold. "Me." "You." Voss paused. "Wash your hands, fix your hair, and whatever you did last night with the king's sons, whatever it was, do not speak of it unless directly asked." Too late to wonder what she knows, Mirren thought. Too late to wonder what she's already told them. She washed her hands. She fixed her hair. She walked through the palace corridors with her eyes on the floor and her heart beat loud in her own ears, a sound like something being hammered shut. The eastern chamber was a room built for intimidation. Myron had never been inside it, but she had heard the other servants describe it. The long obsidian table, the high-backed chairs, the windows that faced north and let in only the cold white light of the winter sky. 7 council members, no fire. On the kind of silence that had been arranged deliberately, like furniture. Councillor Thorne sat at the table's center. She recognized him from a distance, the way you recognize a weather pattern before the storm arrives. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power. His hands were folded on the table. His eyes found her the moment she entered. She stopped 3 paces from the table's edge, as protocol required, and kept her gaze at the middle distance, not quite meeting anyone's eyes, not quite looking away. The posture of a servant who knew her place. "Count the chairs," she told herself. "Count them and breathe. 7 council members, 2 empty seats. And at the far end of the table, half in shadow, the Alpha King. She had not expected him to be there. Her body registered it before her mind did. A pull low in her sternum, like a hook catching on something she hadn't known was there. She fixed her gaze on the middle of the table and did not look at him again. "You are the maid," Thorne said, not a question. "Yes, Counselor." "You were not summoned to the royal den last night." "No, Counselor." "And yet you entered it." The room was very quiet. Mirren kept her hands loose at her sides. "I heard the pups. I thought I could help." "You thought you could help." Thorne repeated the words with a precision that made them sound like something being dissected. A kitchen maid, with no wolf, no rank, no training in the healing arts. There it is, she thought, he already knows. "I had some training as a child," she said. "Now before your wolf severing." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripple move around the table, a counselor to her left shifting in his chair, another looking down at his papers, a third exchanging a glance with the woman beside him. They had known. Of course they had known. The exile order had been built on exactly this foundation. What she hadn't expected was for Thorne to say it aloud. Here, in front of all of them, in front of... She did not look at the end of the table. "The pups were calmed," she said. "That was all I intended." "The pups were calmed," Thorne agreed pleasantly. "By a wolfless Omega who should not have been in that wing of the palace. By a girl who is, as I'm sure you're aware, more already subject to an active exile order." He unfolded his hands and laid them flat on the table. "The question the council is asking, Maid, is a simple one. What are you?" The silence after the question was the loudest thing Mirren had ever heard. "What are you? Not who, not why. What?" "I am a kitchen maid," she said. "You are a kitchen maid," Thorne said, "who walked into a chamber full of feral pups and silenced them in under a minute, when the royal healers had failed for 3 hours. You are a kitchen maid whose presence in that room caused a reaction in the Alpha King's wolf that 3 of my colleagues witnessed and have now formally reported." He tilted his head, the motion almost gentle. "I will ask you again. What are you?" This time, Myron looked up. She looked directly at Thorne, which she had not intended to do. And she felt the silver of her eyes catch the cold northern light from the windows, and she watched him see it. Watched something sharpen in his expression, a recognition that moved through him like a blade finding its mark. "I am what I have always been," she said. "Nothing that concerns this council." It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it as the words left her mouth. But she was so tired, suddenly, of making herself small enough to disappear, and the tiredness had slipped through before she could catch it. Thorne smiled. It was not a warm expression. "On the contrary, you concern this council a great deal." He reached into the papers before him and drew out a single sheet. Heavy parchment, formal script, the kind of document she had been dreading for 3 months. The exile order for one Myron of House Ashvale, he signed by the Alpha King, pending formal execution. The council's position is that last night's events constitute grounds for immediate enforcement. He looked up. Unless someone at this table disagrees. The silence stretched, and then from the far end of the table, a single word. Enough. The Alpha King's voice did not raise itself. It did not need to. It moved through the room the way a change in air pressure moves through a space before a storm. Not loud, but total, the kind of sound that rearranged the air it passed through. Every head at the table turned toward him. Kyle had not moved from his chair. His hands rested on the table's edge, and the only sign of anything beneath the surface was the stillness of them. Too deliberate, too controlled, the stillness of a man holding something back with both hands. "Oi, the pups are sleeping, no," he said. "For the first time in 6 weeks, they are sleeping without screaming. The maid stays until I determine otherwise." His eyes moved to Thorn, and whatever passed between them was not something Myron could read. "The exile order is suspended, pending my review." Thorn's expression did not change. That was the most frightening thing about it, that it did not change at all, as if he had already anticipated this outcome and had already begun planning around it. "Of course, my king," Thorn said. "As you wish." The council was dismissed. The members filed out in the particular silence of people who had much to say and had decided to say none of it here. Myron stood where she had been standing, 3 paces from the table's edge, and did not move until the room had nearly emptied. She was almost to the door when she heard him speak again. Myron. Her name, her actual name, not maid, not girl, not the nothing she had answered to for 3 years. Her name in his voice, which she felt in the back of her throat like something swallowed too quickly. She stopped. She did not turn around. "Look at me," Kyle said. She turned. He was standing now at the far end of the table, and the northern light fell across him in a way that made him look less like a man and more like something the winter had shaped from its own materials. His eyes were on her face, not her hands, not her posture, not the servant's gray she wore. Her face. "Who taught you that song?" he asked. The question was so far from what she had braced for that it took her a moment to understand it. "My grandmother," she said. "She was a healer." Something moved through his expression. Not quite recognition, not quite grief, something that lived in the territory between them. His jaw tightened. He looked away first. "Go back to your work," he said. She went. But she carried the sound of her name in his voice all the way back to the kitchen, and she could not, no matter how she tried, put it down. The summons came before dawn. Not for Myron. She was never summoned, never named, never addressed by anything that required a voice to deliver. The summons came for the exile order itself, which had apparently been sitting unsigned on the Alpha King's desk for 3 months, while the council grew increasingly impatient with the delay. Thorn had requested a formal council session. The session had been granted, and somewhere in the palace's upper corridors, while a decision was being made about a girl who was currently scrubbing ash from the kitchen hearth and trying not to think about the way Cale's hand had felt closing around her wrist. She had not slept. The phantom warmth of that grip had followed her through the dark hours like a sound she couldn't stop hearing, not painful, not frightening, but present in a way that nothing had been present in her body for 3 years. The severed place in her chest, the hollow where her wolf bond had once lived, had done something during the night that she had no name for, not healing, not opening. Something more like a held breath before a word. "Don't," she told herself, and scrubbed harder. The kitchen was empty at this hour except for old Bram, who slept in the corner chair between his duties and snored with the dedication of a man who had given up caring what anyone thought of him. Myron envied him that. She moved quietly around the edges of the room, keeping her hands busy, keeping her eyes down, keeping herself small and gray and forgettable. The ash came away in dark smears. She worked until her arms ached. The door opened. Not the kitchen door. The servants' corridor door, the narrow one that connected the lower household to the upper passages where the guards moved. Myron didn't look up. Looking up was a habit she'd spent 3 years breaking. "The wolfless one," said a voice she recognized immediately. Counselor Thorne's secretary, a thin man named Pell, who smelled of ink and something sour beneath it like old ambition. "Nay, the Alpha King requires your presence." The ash brush stopped moving. He knows. The thought arrived fully formed, certain and cold. He knows what happened in the den, and now he's going to... The council chamber, Pell added, with the particular tone of someone who found the entire situation distasteful. You are to come now. Don't change your clothes. The last instruction was deliberate. She understood that. They wanted her to arrive exactly as she was, ash-smeared, gray-dressed, unmistakably a servant, so that whatever happened next would happen to someone who already looked like nothing. She followed him through the narrow corridor and up 2 flights of stairs she had never climbed before. The palace changed above the servants' level. The floors became marble instead of stone. The walls held tapestries depicting old hunts, old wars, old victories. Myron kept her eyes on the back of Pell's heels and breathed carefully, measuring each breath, because the air up here smelled different, richer, older, carrying the layered scent of generations of pack power. And underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the particular warmth she had been trying not to think about all night. He's close. The council chamber was a long room with high windows that let in the gray pre-dawn light. 7 council members sat at a curved table of dark wood. Thorn occupied the central chair, which was not technically his right, but which no one appeared to be contesting. At the far end of the room, standing rather than seated, was Cale. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. Mirren stopped in the doorway. Pell stepped aside. 7 pairs of eyes moved to her, and she felt the weight of them the way she always felt the weight of collective pack attention, like pressure on a bruise, like being seen by people who were deciding whether she was worth seeing. She kept her gaze on the floor, ash on her hands, ash on her dress. Nothing to look at here. This is the girl, one of the council members said. Mirren of the former House Ashvale, Thorn said, and the name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Her own name, spoken in his voice, felt like a violation. Wolfless Omega. 3 months ago, this council voted unanimously to exile her to the outer territories. The order requires only the Alpha King's signature to take effect. Silence. She heard Kyle move, not toward her, just a shift of weight, the sound of boot leather against marble. I'm aware of what the order requires, he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it from the den. Low, controlled, a sound that lived in the chest rather than the ears. Then you're aware, Thorn continued, that the delay has become a matter of some concern. The girl has been permitted to remain in the palace for 3 months beyond the council's ruling. This sets a precedent that undermines— I said I'm aware. The silence that followed had a different quality. Even Thorn seemed to recalibrate. Myron's fingers had gone cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs, feeling the rough fabric of her dress, focusing on that texture, the scratch of it, the realness of it. Because if she let herself feel the other thing, the hollow place in her chest that had been doing something strange since last night, she would not be able to hold her face still. The exile order, Cale said, was brought to me 3 months ago without a full file. I signed nothing because I had read nothing. I am correcting that now. Thorn's voice shifted, just slightly, just enough for someone paying attention to hear the recalibration. The file is straightforward. The girl severed her own wolf bond at 14 using a forbidden ritual. She is therefore unable to shift, unable to contribute to pack strength, and represents a destabilizing influence on— She calmed my sons. 3 words. The council chamber absorbed them in complete silence. Mirren's head came up before she could stop it. She caught herself immediately, dropped her gaze back to the floor, but not before she'd seen Thorn's expression, the careful, wart-practiced blankness of a man who had just received information he hadn't anticipated and was already deciding what to do with it. The Pups episode was an anomaly, Thorn said. The timing was coincidental. The girl happened to be present when— She was not present by accident. Kyle's voice hadn't changed in volume, but something in it had. She came through a locked door. Oh no, she had not thought about the door. She had not thought about anything when she'd heard the pups screaming. She had simply moved, the way she always moved toward suffering, the way her hands remembered how to move even when her mind told them to stop. The door to the royal den was kept locked during lunar events. She had not considered how she'd opened it. She had simply opened it, he noticed. Regardless of the circumstances, Thorn said. Yeah, and his voice had taken on the particular quality of a man who had decided to stop being careful. The council's ruling stands. The girl is a liability. Her presence in the palace is an ongoing violation of pack law. If the Alpha King has concerns about the pup's care, we can arrange for a proper wolf-born healer to— The proper healers failed. Kyle moved again, this time toward her. Mirren heard his footsteps cross the marble, measured, unhurried, each one landing with the certainty of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry, and stopped somewhere to her left, close enough that the warmth she'd been trying not to think about all night became impossible to ignore. "Look at me." She didn't want to. Looking at him was dangerous in ways she didn't have words for yet, in ways that had something to do with the hollow place in her chest and the way it had been behaving since last night, and the fact that she already knew, somewhere beneath thought, what looking at him would cost her. She looked. His eyes were the same silver gray as her own. She had noticed it in the den but had refused to hold the thought. Now, in the gray pre-dawn light of the council chamber, with 7 witnesses and an unsigned exile order between them, she held it. She had no choice. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. He had already seen her eyes, she realized. He had already noticed. Whatever this was, it was not the first time he was seeing it. He held out his hand. In it was a document, the exile order, she recognized the council's seal, and a quill. "Tell me your name," he said. Not the name Thorne had used. "You're not the name on the document?" Something else? Something he was asking for that had nothing to do with the council or the file or the 3 months she'd spent waiting to be erased. Her throat worked. Around them, the council waited. "Mirren," she said. Just that. Just her name, the one her grandmother had given her, the one she'd been answering to as nothing for 3 years. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than moments should. Then he set the quill down on the table, unsigned, and turned to face the council. "The exile order is suspended," he said, "pending my review." Thorne's chair scraped back. "My lord, you cannot—" "I already have." The memory came back in pieces, the way broken things always did. Myron sat on the cold stone floor of the archive room, her back pressed against a shelf of ledgers no one had touched in years, and let it come. She had kept it locked away for so long that the lock had rusted shut, but tonight, with Kyle's silver eyes still burning somewhere behind her own, the door gave way. She had been 14 the first time she understood what she was being sold for. Her father's study, the smell of ink and tallow candles, and something beneath both. Aldrich's scent, which she had not yet learned to name but already knew to fear. Something like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, sweet gone wrong, sweetness that had curdled into something that made her wolf press flat against her ribs and go very, very quiet. "He will be good to you," her father had said, without looking at her. He's a man of standing. Standing. As if that were the thing that mattered. Wax, as if a man's position in the council could cancel out the way Aldrich's gaze had moved across her body like a hand she hadn't given permission to touch. She had not argued. She had learned, even then, that arguing was a door that opened onto worse rooms. She had simply nodded and gone back to her grandmother's cottage and sat with the old woman's hands wrapped around hers while the healer told her the truth that no one else would. "There is a ritual," her grandmother had said. Her voice had been steady, but her hands had not. "It is forbidden. It is permanent. And it will hurt in ways that never fully stop. Will it work?" Her grandmother had looked at her for a long time. The firelight had made her face into something ancient, something that knew the weight of impossible choices. Yes, it will work. And the ritual itself had taken place on the night of a new moon. No light, no witnesses, no mercy from the dark. Her grandmother had drawn the severance circle in salt and ash and something Mirren had not asked the name of. She had spoken the old words, the ones that predated the pack hierarchy, the ones that reached back to when wolves and humans were still learning to share the same skin. And then she had pressed her palm flat against Myron's sternum, directly over the place where the wolf bond lived, and she had pulled. The sound Mirren had made was not a scream. It was something below sound, a frequency that lived in bone and marrow, a vibration that had no name in any human language. Her wolf had fought. Of course she had fought. She had clawed and bitten and howled in a register only Myron could hear. Wherein the tearing had gone on until Myron was certain there would be nothing left of her when it finished. But it had finished, and she had been left with the silence where her wolf used to be, and the scar tissue on her spirit that ached with every change in weather, and the knowledge that she had chosen this. She had chosen this over Aldrich. She had chosen this over her family's comfort and her pack's approval and every future that had been mapped out for her without her consent. She had chosen herself in the only way available to her, and her family had called it destruction? Mirren pressed her palms flat against the cold stone floor and breathed. The archive room smelled of dust and old paper and the faint ghost of someone's dried herbs. Rosemary, maybe, or something like it. Practical smells, grounding smells, and the kind that had no memory attached. She needed to think. The exile order existed. Kyle had signed it. She knew that now, had known it for 3 months, had been living inside that knowledge, like a woman living inside a burning building, who had simply decided to keep making the bed each morning because what else was there to do? But tonight something had shifted. Tonight he had looked at her, and whatever lived behind those silver eyes had looked back in a way that made the scar tissue on her spirit pull taut like a string about to snap. He didn't know her name. She was almost certain of that. To him she was still a servant, still a shadow, still the girl who had knelt beside his sons and hummed until they slept. The exile order was a piece of paper he had signed without reading. She had heard Thorne say as much. In the corridor outside the council chamber 3 months ago, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who has won something without having to fight for it. The king signed it this morning. He didn't even ask her name. She had stood very still in that corridor, her tray of linens balanced in both hands, and she had not let herself feel it. Not then. She had filed it away with all the other things she could not afford to feel, and she had gone back to the kitchen, and she had made herself useful, and she had kept breathing. But now Kyle had seen her face. Now his wolf had done something. She didn't have the language for it anymore, had lost the vocabulary when she lost the bond. But she remembered enough to recognize the shape of what had happened in his expression, the way his jaw had gone rigid, the way his eyes had gone somewhere else entirely before snapping back to her, harder and more controlled than before. He felt something. The thought arrived without her permission and sat there, solid and unwelcome. He felt something, and it frightened him, and frightened kings sign things without reading them. She needed to leave. That was the rational conclusion, the one her grandmother would have reached in half the time. She needed to take the small bundle of things she owned and the 3 coins she had saved from her quarterly allowance, and she needed to walk out of the palace before Thorne found a reason to accelerate the exile order from pending to immediate. She needed to leave. Her hands pressed harder against the stone floor. Lyra, she thought. The boys. Lyra, who had covered for her twice this week when Mirren had been late returning from the royal den. Lyra, who brought her extra bread on cold mornings and asked no questions and had once very quietly said, "You don't belong in a kitchen, you know. Whatever happened to you, you don't belong here." And the twins, Bren and Kale, who had slept with their small hands curled against her knees, who had woken this morning and looked for her before they looked for their father, who had called her the humming lady with the particular solemnity of 6-year-olds who have decided something matters. She was not their mother. She would never be their mother. But she was the only person in this palace who had found the frequency their wolves needed, and she had not yet figured out why, or in leaving before she understood felt like abandoning something she hadn't finished. "You are going to get yourself killed," she told herself, in her grandmother's voice, because her grandmother had always been the most honest person she knew. "I know," she answered. She pushed herself up from the floor. Her knees ached from the cold stone, and the phantom pain in her chest, the place where her wolf used to live, pulsed once, sharp and specific, like a finger pressing a bruise. She had chosen herself before, in the only way available to her. She had paid a price that had never stopped being paid, and she was still here, still breathing, still making the bed in the burning building because what else was there to do? Tomorrow she would be careful. Tomorrow she would be invisible again. Now would lower her eyes and soften her accent and remember that she was a ghost, that ghosts did not get noticed, that the entire architecture of her survival depended on no one looking at her long enough to see what was underneath. But tonight she let herself sit with the memory of her grandmother's hands, and the salt circle, and the choice she had made at 14 that had cost her everything and saved her life. She had been broken open once before, and survived it. The thought was not comfort, exactly, but it was something to hold. Outside the archive room, somewhere deep in the palace's stone bones, a door closed. Footsteps, measured, deliberate, the particular rhythm of someone who moved like they owned the ground beneath their feet, passed down the corridor and faded. Mirren did not move until the silence came back. Then she stood. He smoothed her gray dress with both hands and went to find somewhere to sleep before morning made her visible again. The ritual chamber smelled of ash and old grief. Mirren sat on the cold stone floor where Thorne had left her, her wrists unbound, but her body still folded inward as if the ropes had simply become invisible. The exile order lay somewhere behind her. She hadn't looked at it since Kyle's voice had broken over her name. She didn't need to look. She had memorized the weight of it already, the way condemned things settle into the body and stay. 3 months of borrowed time, she thought. And this is where it ends? Except it didn't end. The door opened without warning, and the twins came through it like a tide. Not the frantic, flickering children she had soothed in the royal den. These were boys with purpose, their small faces set with the particular ferocity of 6-year-olds who had decided something and would not be moved from it. Rin reached her first, dropping to his knees beside her with a thud that must have hurt. Kale stopped 2 feet away, arms crossed, chin lifted, watching her face with the silver eyes that were entirely his father's. "You're not leaving," Rin announced. Mirren stared at him. Her throat was still raw from not crying. "That isn't your decision to make. Papa hasn't signed it yet." Kale's voice was careful, precise. He chose words the way his father chose silences. "We heard the counselor say so. He needs Papa's seal, and Papa went to the war room, and he didn't take the order with him? He left it unsigned." The thought moved through her like water finding a crack in stone. Not hope exactly, but the shape of where hope had once lived. "That doesn't change what's coming." "It changes tonight," Rin said, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once been told the world would not rearrange itself for his comfort. He reached out and wrapped both hands around one of hers. His palms were warm. His grip was surprisingly strong. "You stay tonight. Tonight is what matters." She should have corrected him. She should have explained the mechanics of power to him gently, the way one explains weather to a child. Not cruel, not kind, simply true. Instead, she sat there with her hand inside his and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. The door opened again. Kyle filled it. He had come from the war room. She could tell by the set of his shoulders, and the way his hands were still half-curled, as if they'd been resting on a map table. His gaze moved across the chamber in a single sweep and landed on the 3 of them on the floor, his sons, and the woman his council had sentenced to die. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. Not anger, not the cold efficiency she'd braced for. "Boys," his voice was quiet. That was worse than loud. "Leave us." Neither twin moved immediately, which told her something about the kind of father he actually was beneath the reputation. Rin looked up at his father with an expression of pure negotiation. "We want to stay." "I know." Kale crossed the chamber in 4 strides and crouched down to his son's level, a movement so fluid and so deliberate that Myron forgot to look away. This close, she could see the exhaustion beneath the authority, the way his jaw held tension like a fist. He placed one hand on each boy's shoulder. "Give me an hour." It wasn't a command, it was a request. The distinction was so unexpected that Myron felt it like a sound she hadn't been prepared to hear. Rin looked at her. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage, and he accepted it as sufficient. Both boys rose, filed past their father, and were gone. The door closed behind them with a sound like a held breath finally released. Kyle remained crouched for a moment after they left, his head bowed, his hands hanging loose between his knees. Then he straightened and turned to face her, and the chamber felt suddenly smaller than it had any right to be. "Stand up," he said. Not unkind, not kind either, simply direct. She stood, her legs held, which surprised her. He studied her face the way she'd seen him study maps, looking for the thing that would tell him where he was. "You severed your own bond," he said. "At 14. "Yes." "To escape the betrothal my council arranged." "Yes." A muscle moved in his jaw. "My council. My signature on that arrangement." He said it flatly, without inflection, but she heard what lived inside the flatness, the particular quality of a man cataloging his own failures. "And then my signature on your exile order." "You didn't know," she said, because it was true, and because she found she needed it to be true. "You signed without reading the names." "That is not a defense." He said it quietly, and the quietness of it hit harder than any raised voice could have. "That is a confession." Mirren didn't answer. But the silence between them had texture now, not the silence of strangers, but the silence of 2 people standing in the wreckage of something and deciding whether to name it. "Thorne told me," Kyle said, "that you are a danger to the pack, that a wolf who severs her own bond is capable of any transgression." He paused. "He has been telling me things like this for 12 years. I have been listening." "And now?" She didn't ask it aloud. She didn't need to. Kyle moved to the chamber's single window, a narrow slit of darkness, the eclipse still holding the sky in its grip, the moon a ring of silver fire at the edge of the world. He stood with his back to her, and she watched the tension in his shoulders and understood that whatever he was about to say was costing him something. "When you hum to my sons," he said, My wolf recognized you." The words landed in her body like a stone dropped into still water, every ring of impact spreading outward. Unstoppable. "I know what that recognition means," he continued. "I have spent the last 6 hours telling myself it was an error, that the eclipse distorted my wolf's senses, that grief makes men see what they want to see." He turned from the window. His eyes, in the thin silver light, were the exact color of her own. "I am not a man who lies to himself for long." "Don't," she thought, "don't say it. If you say it, it becomes real, and real things can be taken away." "I cannot undo the exile order without a council vote," he said. "Thorne controls 3 of the 5 seats. A vote tonight would fail." He crossed the chamber again, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, not the aggressive heat of dominance, but something older, something that her severed wolf spirit pressed toward like a plant toward light it had been denied for years. "But I can delay the execution of the order, indefinitely, while I investigate the circumstances of your original sentencing." Mirren's breath came out unsteady. "That will make Thorne move faster." "Yes." He didn't pretend otherwise. "It will. He has allies. He'll find another way to—" "I know." His voice dropped lower. "I'm not asking you to feel safe. I am telling you that I will not sign." His gaze held hers, and she realized she had stopped looking at the floor entirely, had stopped performing the careful mediocrity that had kept her invisible for 3 years. And she was looking directly at the alpha king of the northern reaches, and he was looking back at her as if she were something he had been searching for, without knowing he was searching. "Not tonight. Not while I still have questions." The mate bond moved between them, not the violent lurch she'd felt in the den, but something quieter and more terrifying. A recognition, a door standing open, her severed wolf spirit, the part of herself she had cut away at 14 and mourned every day since, pressed against the scar tissue of its own absence and made a sound she had not heard in years. Not a whimper, not a howl, something between the two, something that meant still here. Mirren pressed her hand flat against her sternum, over the place where the scar lived. Eaton felt it pulse once beneath her palm like a second heartbeat, answering a call it had forgotten how to make. She was not whole. She was not healed. She was not safe. But her wolf, the wolf she had believed dead for 8 years, had just moved. And Kyle watched her hand press against her chest, and his expression shifted into something she had no name for, something that looked impossibly like recognition of a different kind. "What are you?" he asked. Quiet, wondering, not a threat. She opened her mouth, closed it. The truth sat at the back of her throat like a stone she'd been swallowing for years. "I don't know yet," she said. And for the first time, it wasn't a lie. The eclipse reached its apex at the 3rd hour past midnight. Mirren knew it without looking up. The quality of the darkness changed, thickened somehow. Like the sky had drawn a breath and refused to release it, the silver light that had been filtering through the high windows of the ritual chamber vanished entirely, and what replaced it was not ordinary night. It was something older, something that pressed against the skin like a hand laid flat against a drumhead, stilling all vibration. She sat at the center of the chalk circle Cale had drawn around her, not to trap her, he had said, but to anchor what was coming. She hadn't believed him then. She wasn't sure she believed him now. What is coming, she thought, has already arrived. The severing scar pulsed. It always pulsed during eclipses. That phantom ache along the place where her wolf bond had been cut, the way an amputated limb still remembered its own weight. But tonight the ache was different. Tonight it pulled toward something rather than simply hurting. Toward the man standing at the edge of the circle, his silver-dark hair turned to shadow. His eyes, those impossible silver-gray eyes that matched hers in a way she had spent 3 years refusing to examine, fixed on her face with an intensity that made the air between them feel combustible. Kyle had not spoken in 11 minutes. She had counted. "You know what the circle is for," he said finally. Not a question. "You think my wolf is still there?" Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "You think the severing didn't finish the work?" "I know it didn't." He crossed his arms. A gesture she had learned meant he was holding himself in place by force of will. "I felt her when you hummed to my sons. Something answered the sound from inside you. No, something that recognized the pack frequency." He paused. The muscle along his jaw worked once, twice. Something that recognized me. The chalk lines beneath her seemed to warm. Don't say it, she told herself. Don't give him the word for it. Once it has a name, you can't take the name back. The council meets at dawn, she said instead. I know when the council meets. Thorn will have the exile order re-stamped. He'll have witnesses to whatever happened in this room tonight. He'll call it corruption or contamination or… Mirren! The name stopped her completely. He had never used it before. In 3 years of invisibility, in 3 months of borrowed time, in 3 days of proximity that had cracked something fundamental open between them. He had never once said her name aloud. She had been the maid and the girl and her and nothing. And nothing. And now the word came out of him like something he had been holding in his chest for longer than he understood, and the chalk circle flared gold at its edges, and the eclipse darkness above them shifted, and Myron felt the severing scar split open like a wound that had never properly healed. Not with pain, with light. Oh, she thought, and the thought was not hers alone. She felt it echo back to her from somewhere deep and animal and patient, a consciousness that had been waiting 14 years in the dark behind a door she had locked and swallowed the key to. Oh, there you are, her wolf, not dead, never dead, only sleeping, only waiting, only enduring the long dark of a choice made by a 14-year-old girl who had no other options and had never been forgiven for surviving. Yet the sound that came out of Myron's throat was not a sob and not a howl. It was something between, something that had no name in the human language, that belonged entirely to the old tongue of the pack, the frequency below speech that wolves used to find each other across distances that would break a human mind. It rose from her chest without permission. It filled the chamber. It bounced off the obsidian walls and came back to her changed, harmonized, answered. Cale made a sound she had never heard from him. Low, wrecked, like something enormous had just cracked down the center. He crossed the chalk line. He was not supposed to cross the chalk line. He had said so himself, had said the circle needed to remain unbroken until the eclipse passed. But he crossed it anyway, and the gold light at the edges didn't flare or protest. Yet it simply accepted him, as if it had always known he would come in. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, that specific warmth that had haunted her since the night in the royal den, the warmth that her body had catalogued and refused to forget. His hands hung at his sides, open, not reaching, just open. Tell me your name, he said. Not the one the council uses, not the one on the exile order. His voice dropped to something she had never heard from him before, something that was not command and not request, but something older than either. The one your grandmother gave you? The tears came before she could stop them. Not many. She had learned long ago to keep them small, to ration them, to refuse grief the full territory it wanted. But 2 escaped, tracking down her face in the gold-lit dark, when she watched Cale's expression do something complicated and irreversible at the sight of them. Mirren, she said. It means jewel of the sea. I know what it means. Something moved across his face. Recognition, or grief, or the particular expression of a man who has been holding a door shut for 12 years and has just felt the hinges give. Alara used to say the old names were promises, that whoever gave you yours was telling you what you were meant to become. Alara. He had said her name. He had never said her name to anyone in this palace. She knew this from the kitchen whispers, from the careful silences that fell whenever someone came close to the subject. And he had said it here, in this circle, to her. He is trusting you with something that could destroy him, her wolf said. And the shock of hearing that voice, low and warm and patient after 14 years of silence, nearly undid her entirely. Don't waste it. What does Cale mean? She asked. He blinked. The question had surprised him. She could see it in the fractional loosening around his eyes. One who fights like a storm. Was that a promise, too? The silence stretched between them, and in the silence, she heard his heartbeat. Or perhaps she only imagined it. Perhaps it was her own. Perhaps the mate bond had blurred the boundary between them so thoroughly that the distinction no longer held. The eclipse above them had reached its deepest point. The darkness was absolute. The only light in the chamber was the gold of the chalk circle and the silver of his eyes. The exile order, he said. I signed it without reading your file. I know. I signed dozens of orders each month. I don't… He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. That is not an excuse. No, she agreed. It isn't. He absorbed that without flinching. She had expected him to defend himself, to reach for the language of kings and strategy and the weight of governance. He didn't. He stood in the gold light and accepted the truth of what she had said, and that acceptance was more devastating than any apology would have been. "The order is void," he said. "As of tonight. I'll have it formally revoked at the council session." Mirren's breath caught. Thorn will adapt." The command voice was back, but underneath it now she could hear something else. The storm the name had always promised, yes, but also the eye of it. The still, deliberate center. Or Thorn will discover what it means to oppose his king. The eclipse began to release its hold on the sky. Pale light crept back through the high windows, not silver anymore, but the first gray gold of a dawn that was still an hour away, as if the moon goddess herself was allowing them this small, early mercy. Myron's wolf pressed against the inside of her chest, not with the old phantom pain, with something that felt terrifyingly like hope. She looked up at Kale, really looked, the way she had been refusing to let herself look since the night in the royal den, and found him already watching her with an expression she had no name for yet. She thought she might learn it. The moon rose full and unbroken over the northern reaches, not the fractured, no blood-dimmed light of the eclipse that had started everything. This was the moon restored, whole and silver and ancient, pouring through the obsidian windows of the royal den like a benediction. Marin stood at the threshold of the chamber where it had all begun, and she did not step inside. Not yet. The exile order was still signed. The council's decision had not been reversed. She was still technically a woman sentenced to die in the frozen wastes. And the king who had signed that order stood 12 feet away with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, watching the moon as if it owed him an explanation. She had not been summoned. She had come anyway. Old habit, she thought, walking into rooms you have no right to enter. "I know you're there." Kyle's voice did not echo the way it usually did, that deep, no chamber-filling resonance that made lesser wolves press their throats to the floor. It was quieter, stripped of its armor. "You make no sound, but the air changes when you enter a room. I've been learning that about you." Myron stepped inside. The marble was cold through her thin slippers. The fire had burned low in the grate, and the chamber smelled of pine resin and the particular silence that follows a child's nightmare. The boys had been here earlier, she knew, and had finally been coaxed to sleep by old Wren, the nursemaid, after Myron had sung them the same melody she always used, the one her grandmother had taught her, the one that apparently worked on Alpha King's sons and, it seemed, on Alpha Kings themselves, because Kale had stood outside the nursery door for the entirety of it. She had heard him breathing. "Yet the council meets at dawn," she said, not a question. "Yes. Thorn will push for immediate execution of the exile order." She kept her voice level. She had practiced this, the steadiness, the refusal to beg. "He'll argue that my presence here has already compromised the palace's integrity, that a wolfless Omega who performs forbidden rituals cannot be permitted to remain near the king's heirs." Kyle turned. She had not let herself look at him directly since the night of the eclipse. Not fully. Not the way she wanted to. She looked now. The moonlight caught the silver in his dark hair, the ritual scars across his shoulders visible where his shirt lay open at the collar, the particular stillness of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. His eyes, when they found hers, were the same silver gray she saw in her own reflection every morning, the detail that had haunted her for weeks. "Thorn is not wrong," Kyle said. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Mirren felt the ripple move through her, but she did not flinch. "I know," she said. "You performed the severing ritual at 14. He crossed the chamber slowly, not toward her, toward the fire, which he crouched beside and fed a new log as if he needed something to do with his hands. "You were betrothed to Aldrich. You chose to destroy your own wolf rather than accept that bond." He paused. The fire caught. "I read your file, Myron. All of it. 3 months too late." Her name in his mouth was still a strange thing. Not the way the servants said it. Not the way her family had said it before they stopped saying it altogether. He said it like it meant something. Like he was being careful with it. "You signed the order without reading it," she said. "Yes." "You sign a great many orders without reading them." The muscle in his jaw moved. "Yes." She had not come here to make him feel guilty. She had come because the boys had asked for her at bedtime, had reached for her hands with their small, warm fingers, and called her Mirren in their sleep, and she had realized, sitting between their beds in the dark, that she was no longer willing to disappear quietly. 3 years of practiced invisibility, and these 2 small wolves had undone it in a matter of weeks. Their father had undone the rest. "I'm not asking you to reverse the council's decision," she said. "I'm asking you to hear something first." Kyle rose from the fire. He was close now. closer than was appropriate, closer than she had allowed herself to stand near him since the night in the den when his hand had covered hers and something had cracked open between them that neither of them had been able to name aloud. She could smell him. Not the cold, commanding scent he wore like armor in the council chamber. Something underneath it. Something that had been pressing against her awareness for weeks like a word she kept almost remembering. Home, some part of her said, quietly and without her permission. That's what it smells like. Speak, he said. The command was soft. It was the gentlest order she had ever heard him give. The ritual I performed at 14 was forbidden, she said. I know that. I knew it then. I was 14 years old, and I was terrified. Yet when the only thing I understood was that if I completed that bond with Aldrich, I would not survive it. She held his gaze. I saved myself. I destroyed myself to do it, and I would do it again. Kyle said nothing. His breathing had changed. She could hear it, the slight disruption in its rhythm. What I did not know, she continued, was that a severed wolf bond doesn't die. It waits. It goes quiet and it waits, and sometimes... She stopped, started again. Sometimes it recognizes something it was waiting for, and it wakes up. The silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever stood inside. Myron. His voice had dropped to something she felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that your wolf recognized mine 3 weeks ago in this chamber. And mine recognized yours, and I have been trying to convince myself it was a mistake ever since. Her hands were steady. She was proud of them for that. I'm telling you that I am a wolfless omega with a death sentence and no pack and no name worth speaking, and I am apparently your mate, and I think you already know that. Kyle moved, not toward her. He turned away, one hand pressed flat against the obsidian wall, his head bowed. She watched the tension move through his shoulders like a wave. She watched him fight something enormous and private, the way she had watched him fight it every day for 3 weeks. And she waited. Alara, he said. Just the name, just that. I know, Myron said quietly. I felt her die. He did not turn around. Through the bond, I felt her. I felt the moment she was gone, and a long silence. I swore I would never be bound to anyone again. I signed that order because I do not read names, because names make people real, and real people can be lost. Yes, she said, and I severed my bond because I was afraid of what a bond could do to me. She took one step toward him, then another. We are both very stupid. A sound escaped him. Not a laugh, not quite, but something that had forgotten how to be a laugh and was trying to remember. He turned. His eyes, when they met hers, were not the silver gray of command. They were something rawer than that. Something that had been locked in an obsidian chamber for 12 years and was only now, in the full light of a restored moon, beginning to understand that the door had been open the whole time. The council meets at dawn, he said. I know. I am the king. He said it not as a boast, but as a reminder. To himself, she thought, more than to her. I do not require the council's permission to reverse an exile order. Mirren's breath caught. I require, he continued, closing the last of the distance between them, a reason compelling enough to justify the political cost. His hand rose, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and his fingers found the line of her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. Give me one. She had spent 3 years being invisible. She had spent 3 weeks being seen and terrifying herself with how much she wanted it. She had spent her whole life being careful, being small, being the girl who saved herself by disappearing. She was done disappearing. The pups need me, she said, and so do you. And I think... Her voice dropped to something that was only for him, only for this chamber, only for the moon watching through the obsidian glass. I think I have been waiting for you since before I knew you existed. Kyle's forehead came to rest against hers. The mate bond, which had flickered and pulled and been denied and threatened and nearly severed by fear and politics and 12 years of grief, settled, not with a crash or a blaze or anything that could be called dramatic. It settled the way a fire settles when it finally finds good wood, quietly, deeply, with the particular certainty of something that intends to burn for a very long time. Outside in the nursery, one of the boys murmured in his sleep. Inside, the king of the northern reaches held a wolfless omega maid in the full light of a restored moon and did not let go.